The Gallipoli campaign lasted 8 months before the Allies finally decided to withdraw. In those 8 months, nearly 2,800 New Zealanders died.
In total, the campaign cost the Allies more than 140,000 dead and wounded, and more than 250,000 on the Turkish side.
Back home in Aotearoa, the news was met with complete horror. The censors did their best to hide the full scale of the suffering, but the numbers of dead and injured were hard to conceal. A reporter for the New Zealand Herald overheard this scrap of conversation in a crowd of people waiting for a trainload of wounded men to arrive in Auckland. One person said, "Well, I hope these people will cheer today if they never cheer again in their lives."
The other replied, "Do you? I hope they don't. It will be too sad for cheering."
New Zealanders were still determined to keep fighting, but the original enthusiasm waned, and the supply of volunteers started to dry up.
The government used all kinds of methods to boost recruitment. They tracked down the address of every man who was the right age to fight, then got local committees to knock on the doors of those who hadn't signed up. Men working in vital industries wore special badges to avoid being harassed in the street.
By mid-1916, the government had decided the only solution was compulsory conscription. Any eligible men who refused to fight faced harsh treatment.
286 of these men were imprisoned, and a handful of them were sent to the front lines anyway, where they were often beaten and starved on the order of military authorities.
After the war ended, the government also stripped some citizenship rights from more than 2,000 men who avoided conscription. They were banned from voting or working in government for 10 years.
There was also a strong backlash against Māori who rejected conscription when this was eventually imposed on Waikato iwi. Several dozen Kiangitanga followers were jailed, including King Te Rata's 16-year-old brother, Te Rauanganga.
The Tūhoe prophet Rua Kenana also opposed the war. Armed police raided his marae, killed 2 people, and took Rua off in chains on trumped-up charges. Today, when we think about Kiwi troops in World War I, we mostly think about Gallipoli. But the majority of our casualties came later on in the war, when our men were redeployed to the Western Front in Europe in 1916. Kiwi troops fought in many of the Western Front's most horrific battles: the Somme, Messines, Passchendaele.
At Passchendaele alone, more than 800 Kiwis died in a single day. That's the greatest loss of life we've ever suffered in just one day.
60% of the men we sent overseas became casualties. 18,000 dead, another 40,000 wounded.
The war finally ended on the 11th of November 1918, when Germany agreed to an armistice. On its face, this looked like it had been a huge victory for the British Empire in New Zealand. Britain's opponents in Europe were smashed, and its status as a global superpower had been secured.
But this was only skin deep. The financial and human costs of the war crippled the empire, and the fallout from German defeat contributed to another, even more horrific conflict, the Second World War.